Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Stage 3 peer learning call as part of our Business and Human Rights Accelerator program. So today we're going to be looking at assessing and prioritizing human rights impacts, and it's obviously great to see everyone online again. And just at this outset, thank you so much for making the time. I'm sure your inbox is probably as full as mine on the day between a weekend and a public holiday. We'll just jump to the next slide, please. Now, before we kick off, I do want to acknowledge on behalf of the Global Compact, the traditional owners of the land that we're all dialing in from today. I'm dialing in here from Gadigal country, and I'd of course like to pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as those emerging community leaders. And of course, and I know we're all dialing in from many different locations today, so please feel free to share the country that you're dialing in from this afternoon in the chat as well. Just jump to the next slide, please. Now, I'm going to be brief with this because we have a jam-packed agenda today, and I'm sure many of you know the drill already, but just for a couple of quick housekeeping points. Today's presentation, as you will have seen, is being recorded for those who aren't able to make the session. As usual, we're going to be holding today's call under the Chatham House rule in order to have everybody sharing their perspectives openly. And a general reminder while we do that, please just do keep your cameras on, because it's great to see all of your faces engaged and laughing along as well. Now, this call is just an hour long, so we will jump through to have a look at where we are on the accelerator status. So as you can see by now, each of you should have completed the Stage 3 on-demand content in the Academy, and you would have either dialed into or watched our Stage 3 deep dive call on salience assessments on the 4th of April. Many of you will have also started to work through assessing some of your human rights impacts. So I'm really excited to be welcoming Andrew from KPMG, Michaela from Zimmerman, and Robin from Blackstone to talk through their process as well. Thank you so much for putting up your hands, guys. And at the end of this call, I'll also give you a bit of a preview as to what to expect in Stage 4 of the program. And just as a final point on ambassadors, as many of you will know, as part of the sign-up process, we actually asked you to nominate a company representative to be the ambassador to help you essentially run the due diligence within your own team. So we will be sending out some key messages for those stakeholders this week. So just keep an eye out for that in case there's any questions. Does anybody have any questions on where we're at in terms of accelerator progress or any of the deep dive call pieces? Amazing. I see thumbs up. All right. Okay. Well, with that, I'll hand over to Ness and our amazing team at Pillar 2 to take us through the core content. Ness, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody. A big thank you from me as well for joining, especially if you're in Melbourne. It's a very, very lovely day, so we're glad that you're here with us and not outside. All right, so we're going to start with the content recap, and then we'll go on to our colleagues who will be presenting today. So as I think everyone is aware, we're currently at the stage where we're still looking at identifying and assessing impacts, and in particular, the assessing impacts part of that stage of human rights due diligence, really trying to get a good sense of, now that we have identified all of the different types of human rights impacts that we might have, and particularly areas where the risk of having those impacts might be the most significant, really starting to get a sense of the types of impacts and which might be more salient than others, which might be more severe than others. That's what we're talking about today. Just on to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so I know this is a little bit of revision, but again, what we're talking about when we talk about salient human rights impacts are essentially those human rights at risk of the most severe negative impact through activities and business relationships. And the diagram or the graphic on the right-hand side is really just a reminder that you have, again, this, a big bucket of different types of impacts. And within those, there are likely to be some that are more severe than others, and that can all be relative. And this is something that needs to be considered in changing contexts and at different times. So for some companies, the salient issues that they have right now might be different to what they had before the pandemic. For companies that might be operating in Russia and Ukraine and Myanmar, for example, their issues might as well have changed since those conflicts started. So it's really important to think about how things might change. And so not to do this assessment just once and forget about it, but really to think about doing it every couple of years so that you're considering any changing context which might have an impact. The graphic is also showing you that it's quite unlikely these days to have really severe human rights impacts that are not posing a risk to business at all. Having said that, and as I'll show you on the next slide as a reminder, and I'm sure that you heard it on the shift call as well, is that when we look at severe human rights impacts and saliency, we are looking at it from the perspective of risk to people. So when we try and think about how severe something is, we're not thinking about it in terms of how severe is the risk to the business. We should be focusing on risk to people. But what this graphic is showing you is that given all of the legal developments, legislation, court cases, investor interest, civil society and activist interest, employee satisfaction, all of these financial institutions' interests, that these days it would be quite rare to have something in the kind of top of that triangle that wasn't also posing risk to business, but not always. So it's something just to be aware of, that sometimes it might not necessarily align. We'll go to the next slide. Which areas of the business do you look at when you're doing a saliency assessment? And this also, so we've had 2 questions come through from all of you in relation to this session. And one of the questions was basically about how specific do you need to be when you're doing a saliency assessment, in terms of do you look at a very, very particular type of supplier or something that is not particularly that common for the company? And I guess some lessons out of that, but also more generally in terms of what you've learned so far. When you're looking at salient human rights issues, you should be considering all parts of the value chain, because you're trying to figure out how you could be involved in adverse human rights impacts through your business relationships and through your own activities, and trying to think of all of the different impacts that might come under those buckets, and then start to assess the severity and likelihood of them. So you should be thinking about supply chains. And again, if you think of the cohorts that we were talking about last time, supply chain workers, communities impacted by suppliers, your own operations, what you do yourself in terms of what you make or what you sell or other services that you might provide. And there it's usually employees, contractors, also in some cases community members. And then value chains kind of downstream might be workers in downstream value chains, communities in downstream value chains, and then also customers and end users. Now, when you're thinking about all of this, it is important to think about how the company could be involved in these different types of impacts. And as we'll show you in a moment, it's not going to impact on the actual severity of the impact, but it might have relevance to aspects of likelihood. And it also will be very relevant to how you're going to deal with the salient issues or impacts that you find. Now, these are the terms that you would have heard in the recent session, but also that we spoke about in an earlier session, which is thinking about whether the company has caused, contributed to, or been directly linked to an adverse human rights impact through their business relationships, through their products, services, and operations. And when you're sitting in a salient assessment workshop, it's really good to explain those concepts to your colleagues and for them, and to really encourage them to think about different types of impacts that the company could be involved in these different types of ways when they're brainstorming those impacts for you in a workshop. We don't have time to go through them today in more detail, but a little plug that Chris and I did do a bite-sized learning, and I think some of you have seen. Julia's going to pop the link in the chat, thank you, that explains those concepts in more detail. Now, when your saliency assessments kind of tend to focus on potential indicative impact, so it's a bit hard to kind of think about every single impact the company's ever had, but it's generally helpful to think about this in terms of what could happen in the future and in an indicative way. In terms of the question that was asked by one of you in terms of how specific you should get, when these types of assessments are being done at a group level, we tend to see companies kind of thinking about different categories of impacts or different types of common impacts that can occur, rather than looking at something really, really individualized. But even if something seems quite remote, so even if it's something you'd only be directly linked to and it might not happen that often, it's still good to put that there in a general way. And one of the questions we had was about basically paying for certain services on credit cards and whether it was a good idea to kind of mark down those impacts. I think it's always a good idea to put them down, and they don't have to be really, really specific if you're doing it at the company level. But then you can start assessing the severity and the likelihood of those types of impacts. We'll go to the next one. Thank you. So what is this equation of severity? And it's really severity plus likelihood gets you to the salient issues. So again, we're focusing on risk to people, not risk to business. As I mentioned, the degree of involvement in the harm, so whether you've caused, contributed to, or be directly linked, is not going to determine this equation right here, but it will affect how you respond, and it might be relevant to some aspects of likelihood. And what we're trying to think about is how an impact might typically occur and avoid really unrealistic worst case scenarios. And so you might have had similar experiences in risk workshops that your risk teams have run. We're not trying to think of off the chart things that will never ever happen, but we also don't want to discount worst case scenarios that might have a low likelihood. So you've kind of got to meet that balance. So the equation again, and I'll explain it with a couple of examples in a second. Scale is the gravity of the impact. So again, how deeply were somebody's rights impacted? And it sounds a bit strange to say it, but how badly has someone had their rights impacted? So for example, if a community can't access a local cultural heritage site for a couple of days, but there's no damage, and they're able to access it afterwards versus the complete destruction of a cultural heritage site, it's going to have a worse scale in the second one. Or if we have some workers who have not been paid for, let's say, a month, but then they're paid and their conditions are okay, versus someone who hasn't been paid, let's say, for 3 years and are in very dangerous working conditions. The scale is going to be worse in the second part. The scope is the number of individuals affected, or some people look at the proportion of the community that might be affected. So is it one person or 1,000 people? But if it's one person and that person has lost their life, it's still obviously, or could lose their lives, it's obviously still going to be very severe. Remediability, or sometimes people will say irremediability, is basically, can the rights be restored to the prior state? It's not about necessarily providing compensation. It's about, can that person ever be put back to where they were before in terms of the ability to enjoy a right? And so a breach of the right to life is irremediable. A breach of, let's say, a child losing their right to education over their formative years, or again, that destruction of a cultural heritage site. These are tricky concepts, and they're all also still developing. So we also still, in our own conversations at the GCNA and elsewhere, can sometimes grapple with these concepts and what they might mean in different places. We can go to the next one. Okay, so just quickly on this, but indicative likelihood, and on the right-hand side, these are the terms that we generally use, but different people might use different terms. And you can also really align these to your own risk evaluation scheme. So if you've got a 5-point scale for likelihood, but it has different terms, you could always use those. You're trying to think about, what is the likelihood of this impact kind of occurring given the country you're in, the sector that you're in, the type of business relationship that you have, certain internal business models that you might know might make it more or less likely for the impact to occur, and also the company's perspective on the effectiveness of current relevant controls. And this is where it can get quite tricky again, because you need people in the room who understand what controls are in place. But you also need to accept, I think, that sometimes there will be certain risks like modern slavery, that even with all the controls in place in the world, it's still going to be probably almost certain that that impact is going to occur, because we know that we can't control what is happening often in value chains or deep in supply chains that we might have. So thinking about the controls, but also thinking about the situation that you might be in. A severe potential impact could still be salient, even if the likelihood is really low. And I'll show you the heat map in a moment so that makes it a little bit clearer. We can pop to the next one. All right, so just a couple of examples. One of you asked us how to really see behind the kind of levels of severity and different types of, and what scale, scope, and remediability really mean. And you've probably noticed that Shift, I think for fair enough reasons, has not given you the exact methodology behind how they figure out scale and scope and remediability, because it's often kind of intellectual property that belongs to various organizations doing this. But these examples should kind of give you a bit of a sense of how these terms might play out in practice. So again, gravity of the impact. So a potentially less severe situation in terms of scale might be several workers are asked to work overtime for a few weeks to assist with a peak period. And perhaps they are not paid over that time for their work. So it's not good. There could still be a human rights harm there, but the one next to it is more severe. So workers are exploited using modern slavery, including being forced to work every day without pay, passports are confiscated, and they're not allowed to leave the factory. Scope is the number of people, again, impacted. So again, potentially less severe, 1 or 2 people, more severe, sorry, an entire community. But again, if it's 1 or 2 people and the scale's really, really high and irremediability, then it could still be very severe. Remediability, again, just an example in a kind of occupational health and safety context. A worker has a broken arm due to a work health and safety incident in the workplace versus a worker is permanently disabled. Now, I know somebody with a broken arm could end up being permanently disabled, but let's say that in that first situation, they're able to recover and things are able to improve for them. We'll pop to the next one. I'm speeding because I want to get to our colleagues. All right. So this is, I'm just going to run you through 2 examples. We have put an indication of at least the terms that Pillar 2 uses. I haven't given you everything that comes underneath that. And as I said, different organizations will have kind of different ways of assessing and deciding what bucket or what column different impacts fall into. They tend to be fairly aligned, and there is a little bit of public information in the Danish Institute for Human Rights toolbox on human rights impact assessments that you can look at. But in terms of these 2 examples, so 2,000 workers are deceived into employment in 3 factories owned by a supplier overseas, have their passports and identity, documents confiscated, and are forced to work for 5 years. So the scale there is that, we know it's for a long period of time. They can't go home. They're being forced to work. And so we've put it as basically an extreme total impact on their right to, there's a couple of rights that would be relevant there, but one of them is freedom from modern slavery. Scope 2,000 workers, because basically if something's over around 1,000, then usually it's an extreme, it's kind of a large proportion or a big group that would be considered to be severe from a scope point of view, but different people might use slightly different numbers there. And remediability, this is a tricky one. And again, just showing you again that this is a new area. Generally, people assume that a situation of modern slavery is irremediable because that time has been taken away from somebody, and the mental distress and also physical distress and impacts on people would be irremediable. Sometimes people disagree with that and say that if the victims and survivors actually said that there was a way of restoring them back to where they were before, it could be remediable, but generally we put modern slavery as irremediable. The second one there, and so the level there is about a 5 severity when you start kind of adding all of those together, and 3 likelihood, we just kind of made that up based on just a dummy situation there. The second one, increased traffic through a small community to a newly built manufacturing plant, impacts access to schools and the local market for 3 months. So it is having an access on people, including children, but it looks like it's not for an extremely long period of time. It doesn't seem that extreme. Of course, the more details you add to all of these, the more that you might change your classification. We're saying scope because it's the entire community. It's the whole community that's there. Even if it's a smaller community, it's the whole community. And then remediability, it seems like it's possible to do. And so you start to see that you would not necessarily have all bright red throughout a whole kind of big spreadsheet on this. Just to the next one quickly, I'm almost done. So this is the heat map to show you where those 2 particular risks sit. But if you look at the shift materials as well, what companies tend to do is once they've come up with all of these different types of impacts they think they could have at a group level, or if you're doing it at a site level, it's the ones in the red, essentially the kind of red and sometimes orange area that become your salient human rights issues. So, and then they're kind of grouped up and put up to a higher level to get the issue areas that you'll often see on companies' websites. So you start to kind of plot all of the different impacts that you've had, and then you gather your salient issues from those very, the more extreme parts of the heat map. We'll just go to the next one. So this is just an example to show how some companies have actually then come up with their kind of list, and some have more than others. And you can see different sectors will focus on different issues, which they should, but they often also will have common issues in place, like occupational health and safety or modern slavery, sometimes data protection and privacy as well. So just to show you, and it's becoming very common to start reporting on these issues. And we know that different global reporting frameworks have that expectation too, including the Global Reporting Initiative. And I think now the UNGC Communication on Progress too. And we'll just go to the last slide. Thank you. So this is just to show you that some companies have become quite developed in their salient issues analysis, and they're starting to develop action plans per each issue, and Nestle has that in place. And I think Julia is going to put a link to that in the chat. Thank you. All right. So lots of detail there. We'll have time for questions at the end, but I wanted to start now. I think we're starting with Andrew are we starting with KPMG? Am I right? Do you want to go pop to the next slide? Thank you. And we've asked everyone to answer the same questions, which is basically, have you involved internal, external stakeholders in the saliency process? If so, who did you involve? What were the challenges you actually encountered during the development of severity and likelihood? What were the tricky internal conversations that you had? Because these can be very subjective concepts for people. And then also, what was your kind of subsequent approach to determining your overarching salient issues and really getting to that kind of group-wide list? So we can go to the next one. And we've got Andrew Small from KPMG. So Andrew, over to you. You've got about 5 to 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa. So what I thought I'd do with my few minutes is share a step-by-step summary of how we've approached our human rights salience assessment at KPMG and a couple of the lessons we've learned along the way. And this is an exercise that actually came at a very good time for us because we're in the process of reviewing our human rights policy, and that's something we do every 2 years. So as you can see, we started the process in January this year by carrying out a desk review. And this helped us to gain an initial understanding of some of the human rights impacts that are relevant to our operations and value chain at the moment. As part of this, we looked at third-party publications like the most recent Global Slavery Index, the ITUC Global Rights Index, the TIP report, the Business Human Rights Resource Centre database that I'm sure you're all familiar with, and then also some internal documents like the database our procurement team maintains with responses from our supplier questionnaires. So we then went on to the next step, which was interviews with 24 different stakeholders. This was 16 people from KPMG and 8 external experts. This seems like quite a lot of people, but we actually had a challenge in narrowing it down because there's a wide range of people we could have spoken to. I guess the process we went through to choose the stakeholders to speak to internally, we spoke with colleagues who have specific insight into the 4 areas where we saw potential to have human rights impacts. That's within the community, within our organization, in our supply chain, and in our client work. And the external stakeholders we spoke to were people with specific insights or a connection to human rights, both in Australia and in the Asia Pacific region. There are a few things we took from these interviews. Firstly, there were some clear messages coming through about the contemporary factors influencing our risk of harm to people. Some of these things are new technologies and tools, such as data analytics, generative AI, cloud computing. We were talking to people when ChatGPT was the topic of the day, so I think that showed through in the comments we got. Challenging economic conditions was another key message, and then migration patterns following COVID-19. And then we also gained a long list of about 17 potential human rights impacts. The next step was to share this information with our human rights working group. And this group includes people from risk, OGC, procurement, KPMG Banara, and our government and regulatory affairs team. This group had the task of prioritizing our most salient human rights issues. And we tackled this in 3 stages. We had a sort of a fairly robust discussion about what the long listed human rights mean to people. As you can probably imagine, there were a variety of opinions within the working group. One big challenge we faced was how to determine the level of residual risk that remains for some human rights impacts, despite the controls that we already have in place. We then went through a fairly non-scientific exercise where everyone in the working group rated each potential impact out of 5 for severity and likelihood. Our working group then took a month to reflect on the results of this prioritisation exercise. And at our meeting a couple of weeks ago, the working group looked at a heat map that represented the results of our rating exercise. This was a useful visual aid in prompting some further views and discussion from the working group. And as a result, there were some adjustments about which rights fell in the red, yellow, and the green band. So we now have a list of most salient human rights impacts, but I won't share the final list with you just now because we still have a couple of steps to go. Over the next couple of months, I'll be redrafting our human rights policy so that it reflects the results of our salience assessment. This will then go through a final review and approval process, and then we'll share it with the world. And we'll also be adjusting our human rights due diligence approaches to make sure that they incorporate the most up-to-date salient human rights issues.
Thanks, Andrew. You still had 2 minutes to go. That was very, very efficient. Thank you so much. And I think it shows, and we can talk about this more in question time, but just it's really great to hear about all the dialogue that you did have internally, because I think that you change your mind about things, and as you see things and kind of think about them and then, you know, see them once, then you see the heat map again. And it also shows, I think, why it is good to keep updating these. Your comment about the human rights policy is interesting too, because we're probably seeing kind of quite a few companies start to integrate their salient issues into their human rights policies, and then other companies not doing that because it might be that their human rights policies are kind of stuck in time for quite a long time, and they don't want to put the salient issues there in case they need to change them. So they'll kind of in some cases more commit to identifying the salient issues, but they don't deal with them in the policy. But I think the former is becoming a little bit more common, actually mentioning them. But thank you. We'll all wait to see the final list later in the year. All right, I think we have Jare we have Michaela, sorry. Michaela, go ahead from Zimmerman.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Vanessa. So I think we've often heard over the course of the Business and Human Rights Accelerator that the assessment of salient human rights impacts is an iterative process, and we've very much embraced that concept because this process for us began a couple of years ago. And of course, it led to the identification of some potential impacts, but it was also very helpful to identify some areas to improve the process itself. So we are looking now to kind of redo the process, so a second iteration of this process, incorporating the learnings from that first exercise that we began a couple of years ago. So the assessment began with a series of steps that I like to call the discovery phase, which entailed mapping the company operations, value chain activities, their location. And we did this with the support of multiple internal departments, which include logistics, supply chains, production, sourcing, human resources, and the finance department. Being a company in the fashion industry, we work with value chains, especially the upstream sections, which are complex and long. So a key part of this process revolved around mapping the upstream value chain, so the supply chain. And we wanted to map beyond any direct business relationship, so going beyond our usual business partners that we work with on a daily basis. So for much of this work, we had to rely on the cooperation of our suppliers, but other times we had to resort to publicly available commodity trade flow information to fill in the gaps so that we could get a map as comprehensive as possible. So then we worked to list potential impacts across 5 stakeholder groups, which include, as you can see in the table there on the slide, workers in operations, a supply chain, downstream value chain, communities, and consumers. And when we talk about communities, we looked at communities that could be impacted by operations, by company operations, or by activities in the value chain. So we also probably atypically included in this phase a preliminary assessment of potential involvement But we did this just to make sure that we would be as comprehensive as possible without leaving out impacts that may occur in the initial tiers of the value chain, so further away from company operations, which the company wouldn't be causing, but could be linked to, and that potentially in conversations with internal stakeholders may be forgotten or not considered appropriately because of that distance from company operations. So including a bit of a conversation around potential involvement helped being as comprehensive as possible with that list. And then to draft the list, we used a number of resources, which include audit result, worker surveys, complaints received through grievance mechanisms, reports and country studies from the numerous multi-stakeholder initiatives that have a focus on the fashion industry, as well as conversations with us, with those organizations. Next slide, please. So the same resources that we use to draft the list of potential impacts, we kind of use to assess severity with regard to scale, scope, and irremediability. As we were conducting this exercise, pretty soon we realized that with the information available, we could complete a strong assessment in relation to 4 out of the 5 stakeholder groups. So specifically workers in operations, supply chain, communities, and consumers. And in fact, the main challenge that we encountered with the downstream value chain was assessing the scope. So that for us was the main challenge, identifying how widespread any given impact could be. So after the severity assessment, we moved on to assessing the likelihood. And to do so, we used the information that we had gathered in the discovery phase. That helped us identify the likelihood of human rights infringements by country. And in particular, we looked at conflicts between national laws and international human rights, the presence of conflict situations in a given country, but also in neighboring countries, the presence of vulnerable groups and local customs that could cause discrimination against those groups. We also looked at sector-specific challenges, especially in relation to the supply chain, because that in our industry, supply chain includes a variety of sectors, from agriculture to forestry, the petrochemical industry, mining, through to manufacturing. And each one of these sectors poses specific challenges and potential impacts for workers and communities. As we had already identified specific vulnerable groups in each relevant country in the initial phase, it was very helpful at this stage to combine that information with country and sector specific challenges. But once again, when we did this, so in relation to assessing likelihood, we realized that we had more granular information in relation to the supply chain that we did for the downstream value chain. And once again, we took note of that. And then we moved on assessing Zimmerman's mitigation strategies, including policies, training, capacity building programs that we have put in place. And to conclude the process, we plotted the salient impacts on a matrix. It was sort of a heat map, but it was more of a matrix divided into the 4 quadrants to identify high impact, high severity, high likelihood, low severity, low likelihood, and everything in between. Next slide, please. So given the more granular information available, as I said, the focus resulted to be on the upstream value chain, operations, and to some extent communities. And even though the outcome wasn't as detailed as we had intended in relation to the downstream portion of the value chain. The exercise really helped us identifying room for improvement. So the next phase, which is in progress, will look more in detail into our downstream business relationships and the potential human rights impacts linked to those relationships. So I guess the key takeaway is we were glad that perfection didn't get in the way of getting started with the assessment, because we learned some important lessons that will help us improve the assessment moving forward. Thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I think your last point and several points really resonated there. But your last point just then, I mean, even if you know that you have quite a bit of information, or you can speak with particular functions about certain impacts and really get a good sense of those and the severity of those, I agree. I think it's really good just to start somewhere, and then hopefully, and obviously, a huge amount of work going into what you were doing with upstream, and then getting that new awareness for what might be happening in other parts of the value chain. It was great to see the continuum of involvement reflected there too, because I think, and it sounds like this might have helped you as well, but as I said, when you really start to think about how you could be causing, contributing to, or be directly linked in impacts, you start to have a much broader outlook, I think, of what harm there might be. And I'm sure everyone will have more questions about just the level of information that you had to help determine how severe impacts might be. Your comment about scope 2, that it's really hard to make even an educated guess sometimes on how many people are going to be impacted, but it seems like you really drew on a lot of information sources there, and also for the likelihood. So thank you. I think we've got Robin from Blackstone next as our last speaker. Robin, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I did send through some slides. Have you got those ready to go? Okay, thanks. So what, Blackstone, if you go on to the next one, please. Just a quick bit, Blackstone, we're a small explorer developer looking to develop a integrated nickel project in Vietnam. So currently early stage, we've got a very small corporate office and a team in Vietnam, and we're also using a lot of contractors to do our studies and such like. So just a bit of background, that's Blackstone. So quite a bit different, I guess, to the other two. And we're very much starting this whole human rights journey, I guess. So just a few of the bits that we have got: clear commitment in our, on the next slide, clear commitment in our values around doing the right thing. We have got a human rights policy, which we will update later on this year to reflect what we learn out of we're learning out of the Accelerator. Clearly business activities are a source of human risk, and where we're getting to is that we're currently in the feasibility study phase, plan to go into design and construction, and as we get into that sort of construction is going to be when we get a big step change in our human rights impacts. So it's very much timely for us to be looking now at things. And we very clearly understand that our company actions demonstrate or not our respect for human rights, and that we get benefits out of respecting human rights from the business point of view. And clearly human rights underpins our social license. If we don't do the right thing from a human rights perspective, we're not going to get our social license, and we need that for our long-term operations. So it all sort of fits together there. Next one, please. So what we've been looking to do is to look, we've got clearly the starting point is the next slide, if we could, Vanessa. We've got the starting point is the Declaration of Human Rights. We've got the two conventions and the ILO declaration. Can we get the next slide up? Something happening? No. So really where we're trying to look is we've got the human rights, we've got the two conventions, and looking at it in the context of it operating in Vietnam, the work that we're doing, so our mining operation, and so a clear understanding of the types of impacts that the industry that we're in has. So very much around clear impacts around land use, health and safety, environment and such like. So one of the things we've looked to try and do is just understand, what are the issues associated with operating in Vietnam. Again, just a quick web search and tossing up Human Rights Watch report on Vietnam. And clearly there's issues operating in Vietnam largely around rights around association, freedom of speech and such like. So again, that's just to help us to understand, the type of situation that we're operating in. Next slide, if I may. And so from that sort of list of impacts that we were looking at around land use, environment, community health, just trying to put together a very high level heat map around salient issues. And again, trying to link where we are a cause of these human rights impacts, where we're contributing and where there might be a linkage. So clearly this land use issue is our highest human rights risk at the moment. Working our way back down through workers, there's probably 3 different levels where we have our own workers. It's at one level, and we'll be using a large number of contract workers, and then clearly further down the supply chain, we've got a linkage through to suppliers. So that's the sort of where we're starting with our first pass, if you like, at a heat map. Sort of focusing in on that land use issue and why it is such a big issue. Just grab on to the next slide, 2 slides very quickly. So land use competition for land is always an issue for companies and communities. So for us, in the mining industry, large footprint, we'll have a land use change of somewhere in the order of 400 hectares to build a refinery. There's probably another 1,000+ hectares with our mining operation. So it's a big impact on local communities. If you just grab through on to the next slide, please. And we know that any type of change is challenging, and land use change is extremely challenging and high risk for local communities. There's a long history of poorly done land acquisition around all sorts of industries, and so some of these big risks around land use change, I think all of those would see those as direct human rights risks. There are some things that we can do, and we'll be looking to do around trying to reduce those risks. One is to try and minimise our footprint in the first place, but clearly, broad consultation, gaining consent rather than relying on government edict to get access onto the land, paying fair compensation, restoring livelihoods, providing options to people around what they might want to do in terms of resettlement, in terms of location and types of compensation, that type of thing. So there are things that we can put in place that we are looking to make sure that we adequately address as we sort of move into this area. But hopefully, you get the picture as to why this is such a big issue for us. We go on to the next one. We've tried to then look at what are those sort of salient human rights issues within that land use area, and ranging from the right to self-determination through to the right to an adequate standard of living, right to health, right to work, opportunities for people to have their say in determining their future notwithstanding, we are going to have that impact. There's no question about it. So that's specifically around the land use bit, where we're trying to get our heads around the sort of impacts that we're having on human rights. More generally, again, onto the last slide, if you wouldn't mind, just having a look at how do we actually fit all of this stuff together into a broad, into our business strategy. And I guess with a lot of other frameworks and other sort of ways of looking at things, if you like. So, we've got a clear strategy around our net zero aim for green nickel. We're now in the process of looking at things through a human rights due diligence lens. There's lots of parallels around good business risk management. You've got the cause contribution linkage bit of human rights. You've got scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. You've got the sustainable development goals. How do you bring all of that together in a sort of a simple way that isn't going to, that's just easily understood initially within a small group? So how do we actually put this all together for our executive? That's the next level for us here, is putting together this sort of primer and approach for the executive to get them to buy into the thing. From the executive, it goes up to the board, it goes down to the broader workforce. So how do you actually bring all of that together into a sort of a simple, coherent sort of picture? That's probably our current challenge, I think. Anyway, that's it for me.
Robin,
Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And I think it's, again, I mean, we've heard so many important points today, but you don't want to end up with a list of salient issues that can never then be integrated back into everything you're doing across sustainability, and where it doesn't, for instance, mean anything to the risk team and you've got different regimes going on and no one's using it. So I think that's really important. And thank you also for showing us the deep dive into land, because again, we see quite a few companies that end up with their kind of really super high level of salient human rights issues, but it's sometimes unclear how much work is actually being done behind the scenes on each of them. And that's why it was interesting to see what you did, but also if you think of the Nestle human rights action plans, where they really are trying to, I think, show publicly what they're doing on every issue. And it's great to see how you've kind of drilled down on some of those. We've got about 9 minutes, Chris, for a bit of a chat. We've got some discussion questions, so you can pop to the next slide, Lauren, but I really wanted to open it up to see if anyone wanted to ask Andrew and Michaela and Robin any questions, because I have so many questions, but I'm going to shut up now. Does anyone want to ask anything about challenges, or want to test anything that you're doing with your peers? Any questions for the panelists? Can't see any hands. All right, let me just ask one to kick it off, I guess. Well, one of them is around just how tricky the discussion was, and if at any point you had to go back to convincing why this area is important and why you need to do this. But also, I mean, Andrew in particular, I think you were talking about the various internal discussions that you had, and whether people were having difficulty with these concepts of scale, scope, and remediability, and also likelihood, because they're not easy for every type of impact to talk about it. Some are more obvious than others. So I guess, yeah, did any of you have challenges just again convincing people that this was something to do? And I guess particularly for those of you that are considering publishing your saliency assessments, any pushback on the idea of putting out a public list of this and just the different considerations there? So I might just see, I'll pick on you first, Andrew, see if you've got any comments on that question, and then come to Michaela and Robin.
Yeah, I mean, there were definitely challenges that arose through the discussion, and that's why we deliberately left some time in between the different stages of the discussion, because we wanted to give people the chance to reflect, have discussions with their teams. I mean, one example, an issue that appeared on the long list of our potential salient issues was the right to health. And that means different things to different people. For some people, it's access to, a flu vaccine. To other people, it's health and safety. To other people, it's, respect at work. So I think that was why it was important to bring the group together to have that discussion, to really, have these tough discussions and hammer it out. In terms of sharing the saliency assessment, in our current human rights policy, we have, a list of issues that were identified when the policy was drafted. So we've kind of got that precedent for including the salient issues. I think our, our working group might be a little bit reticent about sharing the heat map, just because some people don't like the idea of things being marked as red. But yeah, like having the salient issues integrated in the policy itself, I don't think that will be a barrier.
Yeah, that's great. It's good that you've got that precedent there. It's interesting though, we've had seen some companies, including overseas, that have started to include climate change and just transition kind of phrased in different ways in their public salient issues. And speaking to a few colleagues overseas, it's been interesting how some of the more longer term issues that the company had faced, or it was, had published and talked about for a long time, were easy to get through, but issue like a new salient issue around climate change and just transition was much harder for them to get through, with kind of in-house legal teams worrying about, what does it mean to tell the world that something like that is a salient issue. But on the other side, in this day and age, not having it there is very challenging. Michaela, any views on just the challenges that you had, any pushback, or just, and your thinking as well about publishing, or what you've seen other companies do in that space?
Yes, of course. We do have a sort of precedent as well. When we did our first sustainability report, again, a couple of years ago, we went through a similar exercise. It was a bit more comprehensive. It looked at environmental issues, but human rights were very much part of that conversation already. We already integrated a consideration for impacted stakeholders in that materiality assessment. So we didn't only look at risk for the business, but we also looked at the scale of the impact on potentially affected people. And I guess that opened up the conversation to a more human rights focused dialogue, which will lead to publishing a list of salient human rights impact. But in the context of the sustainability report, we did publish a list of 10 strategic priorities, which also link back to potential impact. So I feel like that's already a little bit of an exercise to make everybody comfortable, or more comfortable, about disclosing that kind of information. I can relate to Andrew on the heat map. We did not publish the heat map in that case, in the case of the materiality assessment, but we did discuss the process in detail, as well as then publishing the final list. So I'm comfortable and confident that we'll get there once we have a second iteration of the salient human rights impact assessment.
Thanks, Michaela. And I think that, I think we don't seem, I'm not sure I've ever seen a company kind of publish a heat map. You can get some provide quite a bit of detail, but the heat map, particularly where you see kind of the very high risk and the red, is very tricky. But it's great to see you integrating having the strategic impacts and sustainability report also shows how these issues are all interlinked. Robin, quick response from you, and then I'll very quickly open it up to the floor. But any particular challenges you had with people determining the scale, scope, and remediability part?
I think we're probably not quite there yet. This at the moment is very much, it's my colleague Janine and I and our sort of ambassador working our way through all this stuff. And so once we've got something sort of clear in our heads, is take this through to the executive, in the broad context around human rights in the business, because it is a new thing for the business. So that's I guess is where we're at. I think I'm expecting a positive result from the exec. Everything that we've done so far around sustainability has been very positively and enthusiastically sort of embraced. So I'm seeing that we should get a good result, but couldn't tell you quite how that's all going to pan out right now.
Yeah, and I think that it gives you a chance, like when you're doing these workshops or interviews or whatever way you do it, and you can see from what you had on your slides of the different rights in the Universal Declaration and just the different way you went through it, it's an educational exercise as well, because you're raising people's awareness and you're giving them the chance to ask their challenging questions. I'm going to make Chris give a very squished closing, but does anyone have any other questions just about what we talked about, any challenges that you're having yourselves? Anything final?
Sorry, I actually have a genuine question. If you
okay,
can you throw it?
Not bad.
No, so Robin's example just brought something to my attention. So there's sometimes the need for companies to be assessing human rights issues and impacts before there's any business operations. And I think the mining example is a good one because you're looking at a potential site, but there's no boots on the ground yet. How should a company go about assessing in that situation? Like with this sort of, it's like kind of desktop research at that point, right? Or is it, how should they go about that?
It's a really good question. And in some situations as well, you'll be thinking about your salient issues kind of at a higher level, but that is no substitute for actually also doing a human rights impact assessment on the ground, even before you might have started operations, but kind of having people on the ground speaking to rights holders and talking about all that. But if you're just trying to get a sense of, high level salient issues, I think many of the resources that Andrew was talking about, that Michaela was talking about, and what we could see that that Robin was using too. So, sector type risks that you might be anything from the responsible sourcing tool, the US State Department reports, the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, as Andrew was saying, trying to get the sense of the country risks as well. So Robin had the Human Rights Watch kind of report details up there, trying to really just think about and look at also allegations that other companies that are operating in that country might have faced, to really get a sense of what's going on. And then I think it is very powerful to try and speak to a local NGO to try and get a sense of what do they think might be the company's most severe issues if they do go down on the ground. But as I said, these assessments don't usually involve speaking to actual rights holders, and that's what an actual fully blown human rights impact assessment is, that I would always recommend, if you're starting to have a very deep operation in a particular country. I know we're at time. I'm going to give Chris a chance just to finish up with the last slide, and then we will stop. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ness. Sorry, guys, nearly at time. Just to give you a really quick intro to our deep dive stage 4, which is going to be held next Wednesday, I believe. This will include some engagement steps and messaging for practitioners to use in internally making that case. So we're going to be looking at a particular salient human rights impact, like feel free to identify one or use more if you'd wish. But it's great to hear that companies are already, going through some of that, and especially thank you to those of you today that have talked through some of your own processes and plans. Shift are also going to be talking through different types of leverage that you can use in implementing into your action plan as well. We're at time already, so thank you so much, everybody. That wraps up our stage 3 peer learning call. Thank you all for your time, and of course, thank you to the participants for sharing the work you've been going through internally. I could spend all day asking you questions, as I'm sure everyone else could. As with last time, we'll of course send around a recap of the session, including the content at the start of it, which was recorded. Please keep an eye out for emails going out to ambassadors, and of course, happy to answer any questions that they may have as part of those as well. That's it from me, guys. Thank you, everyone, and have a great Monday.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, everyone.